The vacation was supposed to be a fresh start. Megan had insisted on it, a luxury trip to an exotic island, just the two of us. "We need this, Alex," she'd said, her eyes full of longing. She spoke about rekindling the romance, escaping the stress of daily life, and finally getting back to who we used to be. I had my doubts, but I wanted to believe her. So, we packed our bags and flew halfway around the world, hoping this paradise could bring us closer. At first, everything seemed perfect. The resort was more than we could have imagined: pristine beaches, turquoise waters, and lavish amenities. We spent our days basking in the sun, sipping cocktails, and sharing intimate dinners under the stars. It felt like we were falling in love again. Yet, even in paradise, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The signs were small at first, almost too subtle to notice. Megan would glance at her phone more often than usual, her expression unreadable. She seemed distant, distracted even, during conversations. It wasn't just her phone. Sometimes she'd step away during our relaxing moments, saying she needed to check on some emails or make a quick call for work. That didn't sit right with me. We had come all the way here to escape work, hadn't we? Still, I dismissed the thought, blaming it on my own paranoia. Megan was always busy back home. Maybe she was just finding it hard to unplug completely. But as the days passed, her behavior became more puzzling. She would leave the hotel for hours, giving vague explanations like, "I'm going for a walk," or "I'll be at the spa." When I offered to join her, she'd say, "It's just some time for myself," brushing off my concern with a casual smile. It felt rehearsed, as if she had expected me to ask. Then one afternoon, after she said she was heading to a yoga class at the resort's wellness center, I decided to see for myself. I watched from our balcony as she walked down the path, but instead of heading towards the wellness center, she took a turn that led out of the resort. I felt my stomach tighten. Why lie about where she was going? Curiosity gave way to suspicion, and I found myself quietly trailing her down the narrow street lined with tropical trees. I kept my distance, not wanting to be noticed, but close enough to see where she was headed. After a short walk, Megan stopped at a quaint little cafe. She took a seat at an outdoor table, where a man was already waiting. I froze. There she was, my wife, sitting across from a stranger, laughing in a way I hadn't seen her laugh in years. She reached out and touched his arm, her face lighting up with the kind of excitement I thought she had lost. It was the kind of look she used to give me when we first started dating. But now, it was for someone else. I snapped a quick photo on my phone, feeling my hands tremble. I wasn't sure what I had just stumbled upon, but I knew it was more than just a friendly chat. My heart raced with a mix of anger and disbelief as I watched them talk, oblivious to my presence. How long had this been going on? Was this planned before the vacation? Or was I witnessing the start of something right under my nose? Megan's solo time had become too frequent to ignore, and now I had a face to put to my suspicions. She was meeting him here while I sat alone back at the resort, believing her excuses about yoga classes and spa treatments. It was like a cruel joke, and I had been the punchline. As I walked back to the resort, my mind raced with questions and painful realizations. The more I thought about it, the more everything started to make sense: her constant phone use, the secretive behavior, the way she avoided spending too much time alone with me. She had planned this vacation as a cover, a perfect excuse to keep her affair hidden in plain sight. I wasn't sure what I was going to do, but one thing was certain. This vacation was not going to end the way Megan expected. If she could lie and deceive me like this, then it was time for me to change the rules of the game. I wasn't going to confront her right away, no. That would be too easy. I was going to make sure that Megan's perfect escape turned into something she would never forget. The paradise she thought she had created was about to become a battlefield. And this time, I would be the one holding all the cards. After that day at the cafe, my view of Megan shifted completely. Every smile, every word, every touch felt like an elaborate act. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. This wasn't a spontaneous fling that had just begun on the island. It had been planned, and I was the unwitting fool dragged along for cover. I knew I needed to gather more evidence, something undeniable, before confronting her. If she could betray me with such ease, I wasn't going to let her slip away with just excuses. The next morning, Megan announced she'd be going for another yoga session. I nodded, hiding my frustration behind a calm facade. She kissed me on the cheek, but her affection felt hollow, like an echo of what used to be real between us. As soon as she was out the door, I began my own preparations. I knew she would likely meet him again, and this time, I wasn't going to be just a passive observer. I followed her at a distance, being careful not to draw attention. She took the same path as before, but instead of the cafe, she walked a little further down the road and slipped into a small boutique hotel. My stomach churned at the thought of what was happening behind closed doors. I waited outside, anxiety gnawing at me, but I forced myself to stay. I needed to be certain. After about 2 hours, Megan finally emerged, her expression relaxed and content in a way I hadn't seen for months. She casually glanced around, then walked back toward the resort as if nothing had happened. Once she was out of sight, I approached the front desk of the hotel. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I had to try. "Excuse me," I said to the receptionist, keeping my tone polite and friendly. My wife mentioned she left something behind in her friend's room. It was a surprise for our anniversary, and I wanted to see if I could retrieve it. The receptionist hesitated, then asked, "Do you know the room number?" I took a guess, recalling which floor she had exited from. "Second floor, I think," I said, feigning uncertainty. "Room 214, perhaps?" "Ah, yes," the receptionist replied, typing something into the computer. "There is a note for the guest to pick up an item. I can let you know if they've returned it later." So, Megan was meeting someone in that room, likely the man from the cafe. My pulse quickened as I tried to piece together the full picture. I thanked the receptionist and left, my mind racing with anger and pain. It was becoming clear that this affair wasn't just some random island fling. There was a deeper connection between Megan and this stranger, and I was determined to uncover every last detail. Over the next few days, I continued to track Megan's movements. I became an expert at staying hidden, always a step behind her but never too close. She frequented the same boutique hotel, sometimes staying for hours. I noticed other patterns, too. The way she would send quick text messages before disappearing, or how she would suddenly change plans with me, claiming she was exhausted or needed some time alone. I began monitoring her phone as discreetly as possible. She was careful, but not careful enough. One evening, when she left her phone unattended by the pool, I managed to take a quick look. There was a message from someone named Jay. It was brief and vague, just a simple "see you later," but that was enough. It wasn't just some casual encounter. She was coordinating with him, planning their time together. My initial shock turned into cold resolve. If Megan thought she could deceive me this easily, she underestimated just how far I was willing to go to uncover the truth. I started snapping photos of her at the boutique hotel, documenting the times she met Jay. I wasn't sure what I would do with the evidence just yet, but I knew it would come in handy. I needed undeniable proof of her betrayal, not just for the confrontation I planned, but for myself. I needed to know that I wasn't imagining things, that my suspicions were grounded in reality. I also began to notice something else. The more I tracked Megan, the more detached I became from the pain. It was as if I were watching a story unfold from a distance, rather than living through it. My emotions had shifted from devastation to determination, and I knew that Megan would soon face the consequences of her actions. Finally, after a week of watching and collecting evidence, I felt I had enough. I had documented her meeting Jay multiple times, captured photos of them together, and even overheard snippets of their conversations as I discreetly recorded from nearby. I was ready to confront her, but not in the way she might expect. This wasn't going to be a typical argument where she could deny, cry, and beg for forgiveness. I had a different plan. If she wanted to betray me with such boldness, I was going to respond in kind. Megan wasn't the only one who could play games. There was a girl I had met at the resort, Stephanie, a beautiful tourist who was friendly and outgoing. It was time to take this to the next level. If Megan could enjoy a secret vacation fling, then so could I. She thought she was being clever, but she had no idea what was coming. After days of watching Megan's deceit unfold, the hurt I initially felt had morphed into something darker, an urge for revenge. If she could carry on her affair right in front of me, then it was only fair that she experienced a taste of her own betrayal. I wasn't going to confront her directly, not yet. Instead, I would make sure that when she finally learned what I had planned, it would hit her with the same force that her actions had hit me. I wasn't going to let her off the hook that easily. There was someone I had noticed around the resort, Stephanie. She was a young tourist, probably in her mid-20s, with an infectious smile and an adventurous spirit. We had exchanged friendly greetings a few times by the pool, and she had even joined a few of the group activities I'd participated in while Megan was busy. It hadn't meant much at the time, but now, Stephanie seemed like the perfect accomplice for my revenge. I approached her by the bar one evening. While Megan was off on one of her solo adventures, Stephanie was sipping a cocktail and chatting with another tourist. As I joined the conversation, I made a point to be charming and engaging, turning the full force of my attention toward her. It didn't take long before we were laughing and sharing stories about our vacations, with her enthusiasm matching mine. We spent the evening together, starting with drinks at the bar and then taking a walk along the beach under the moonlight. I was careful not to push things too quickly, letting the night unfold naturally. It was as if the universe had given me the perfect opportunity to execute my plan. And as we strolled along the shore, Stephanie playfully took my hand. It felt different from when Megan used to do the same. It was lighter, freer, and yet filled with the kind of excitement I hadn't felt in years. As the night went on, we ended up back at the resort's dance floor, where the music blared and couples moved in sync. I leaned in closer to Stephanie, letting the rhythm guide us. I could see Megan's betrayal in my mind, and the anger that simmered beneath the surface pushed me closer to Stephanie, my touch more intentional. It was more than just an attempt to even the score. It was a way of reclaiming the part of me that Megan had taken for granted. The next day, I made sure to arrange another accidental meeting with Stephanie at the pool, where we continued our flirtation, sharing drinks and laughter. Megan, unaware of what was brewing, continued her own secret escapades with Jay. It was almost laughable how oblivious she was to what was happening right under her nose. As the days went by, Stephanie and I grew closer. I didn't hide my interactions with her. In fact, I made sure that our moments together were visible, taking long swims in the ocean, sharing intimate dinners, and making a spectacle of our shared laughter. I knew Megan would notice sooner or later, and I wanted to be the one to plant the seed of doubt in her mind. If she had the audacity to carry on her affair so brazenly, then I wanted her to see that I wasn't sitting idly by. And then it happened. One afternoon, as Stephanie and I sat at a cafe by the beach, I saw Megan walking towards us from a distance. She hadn't seen us yet, but there was no mistaking the look on her face when she finally did. A mix of shock and confusion. Her pace slowed, and for a moment, it seemed like she might turn around and leave. But then she kept walking, right past us, glancing in our direction as if to confirm what she was seeing. I didn't say anything, didn't call out to her or acknowledge her at all. I simply continued the conversation with Stephanie, my tone casual and relaxed, as if nothing was amiss. It was a small victory, but it was a start. I could see the suspicion forming in Megan's eyes, the way she was beginning to second-guess what was happening around her. And for once, it wasn't me chasing after her or demanding answers. Now, she was the one who had to wonder. The next phase of my plan was already forming in my mind. It was time to escalate things, to force Megan's hand and make her realize just how far I was willing to go to expose her betrayal. The groundwork was laid, and soon, I would push Megan to the edge, where she would have no choice but to confront the reality of her actions. It was time for her to see that the paradise she had so carefully crafted was about to crumble, and I would be the one tearing it down, piece by piece. The moment Megan glanced at us in the cafe, I knew I had planted the seed of doubt. Now, it was time to make her see the full picture. It wasn't enough for her to suspect something was going on between me and Stephanie. She needed to be confronted with the consequences of her own actions. I wasn't just seeking revenge. I wanted Megan to feel the sting of betrayal and humiliation in a way that she could never forget. Over the next couple of days, I continued spending time with Stephanie. We grew closer, and it didn't take long before our interactions became more affectionate. A kiss here, a lingering touch there, enough to be noticed, especially by someone as observant as Megan. I didn't hide anything. I made sure our encounters were always in places where Megan could stumble upon us, whether it was by the pool, at the beach bar, or on the dance floor. One evening, I saw my opportunity to deliver the final blow. I knew Megan had plans to have dinner with Jay at a popular restaurant in town. It was the same place where I had seen them together before, sharing laughter and stolen glances. I made a reservation for Stephanie and me at the very same restaurant, at a table with a clear view of Megan's usual spot. I wanted her to see us up close and undeniable. The restaurant buzzed with the sounds of clinking glasses and chatter when Stephanie and I arrived. I noticed Megan and Jay sitting in a corner booth, already deep in conversation. As we walked past them to our table, I felt Megan's eyes on me. She stiffened in her seat, her expression a mix of shock and anger. I gave her a subtle nod, acknowledging her presence, but said nothing. I wasn't going to make this easy for her. She was going to have to come to me. As Stephanie and I settled in, I could see Megan struggling to focus on her dinner. She kept glancing over at us, her frustration visibly growing. I leaned in closer to Stephanie, my voice low and intimate, making sure to brush her hand with mine. I wasn't doing this to rub salt in Megan's wounds, at least. That's what I kept telling myself. It was about forcing her to face the truth she had tried so hard to keep hidden. It didn't take long before Megan could no longer pretend to ignore us. She abruptly excused herself from the table, leaving Jay behind. Her movements were tense as she approached me, her voice trembling with restrained fury. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded, her eyes darting between Stephanie and me. I looked up at her with a calm expression. "Just enjoying dinner," I replied evenly, taking a sip of my wine. "Why? Is there a problem?" Stephanie, sensing the tension, glanced curiously between Megan and me. "Alex, is everything okay?" she asked, her tone concerned. I gave her a reassuring smile before turning my attention back to Megan. "What is this?" Megan hissed, her voice low but furious. "You're parading around with some," she paused, glancing at Stephanie, who was now watching her with a raised eyebrow. "Girl, while we're supposed to be on vacation together." I met her gaze, unflinching. "It's funny you should say that," I said slowly, "because while we're on this romantic getaway, you've been sneaking around with him." I nodded in the direction of Jay, who was still seated at their table, looking uncomfortable as the scene unfolded. Megan's face paled, her mouth opening as if to protest, but no words came out. She was caught off guard, and for the first time in a long while, I saw genuine fear in her eyes. "I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered, glancing back at Jay, who now seemed more interested in his plate than getting involved in the confrontation. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms as I spoke. "I've seen you, Megan. The little meetings, the hidden phone messages. I know about the hotel and the lies you've been telling me. So don't stand there and act like you're the victim. You're just upset because I decided to stop playing the fool." The color drained from her face, and she took a step back, struggling to maintain her composure. "You don't understand," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "It's not what you think." I cut her off, my voice cold and steady. "I understand perfectly. You wanted your little fling, your escape, while keeping me in the dark. But you know what, Megan? I'm done being the fool. Now you know how it feels." She stared at me, her eyes wide with a mix of shock and desperation. For a moment, I thought she might try to defend herself or explain, but instead, she turned and hurried back to her table, her movements frantic. Jay shot me a quick, uncomfortable glance before getting up to follow her out of the restaurant. Stephanie, who had remained silent during the exchange, looked at me with a mixture of sympathy and concern. "Alex, are you sure you're okay?" she asked softly, reaching for my hand. I nodded, though I wasn't sure how I felt. There was a hollow satisfaction in seeing Megan finally exposed, but it didn't erase the pain or the anger that lingered. It was just the beginning of what I had planned for her. Megan thought she could play games, but now she would see that I wasn't just reacting, I was taking control. The mask had been ripped away, and there was no going back. For Megan, the vacation was no longer a paradise. It was about to become a reckoning. After the confrontation at the restaurant, I expected Megan to lash out or try to explain herself the moment we got back to the resort. Instead, she retreated into silence, keeping her distance from me for the rest of the night. It was almost as if she was hoping to pretend the whole incident hadn't happened. But there was no way she could ignore what I had just exposed. The truth was out, and she was no longer in control of the narrative. That was my role now. The next morning, I saw Megan sitting alone on our balcony, staring at the ocean. I could tell by her expression that she hadn't slept well. There was an uneasiness in her demeanor, like a person living on the edge, unsure of her next step. I didn't wait for her to start the conversation. I walked out onto the balcony, leaning against the railing, and spoke in a calm, controlled tone. "So, are we going to talk about what happened last night?" I asked, breaking the silence. Megan's shoulders tensed, and she turned to face me, her eyes red as if she had been crying. "What do you want me to say, Alex?" she replied, her voice low and unsteady. "Yes, I've made some mistakes, but it's not as simple as you think. It's complicated." I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. "Complicated? That's the excuse? Megan, you lied to me again and again. You brought me all the way out here just to keep up the charade. And now that you're caught, you want to call it complicated?" She flinched at my words, her face contorting with a mix of anger and desperation. "You don't understand, Alex." She paused, trying to find the right words. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. I didn't plan to hurt you." "Well, you did," I shot back, my voice rising. "You don't just accidentally have an affair, Megan. You made a choice, over and over again." The frustration and anger I had kept bottled up were finally spilling out. "And the worst part? You tried to make me think I was the problem, that we needed this vacation to fix things. But it was never about fixing us. It was about keeping your little secret." Her eyes flashed with defiance. "And what about you, Alex? You think I didn't see you parading around with that girl, flaunting your little fling right in my face?" she shouted, her voice trembling. "You're not innocent here either. You were trying to hurt me just as much." I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "You're right," I said slowly. "I wasn't innocent. But the difference is, I was responding to what you started. You pushed me away, Megan, long before we even got here. So yes, I decided to give you a taste of your own medicine, because you needed to feel what it's like to be lied to be betrayed." She shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "Alex, I'm sorry," she whispered, almost pleading. "I didn't want things to turn out like this. I still love you. I do." Her words hit me like a blow to the chest, but I didn't let it show. "You don't get to say that," I replied coldly. "Love doesn't look like this. Love isn't sneaking around with someone else while lying to your husband's face. Love doesn't drag us both out to an island just to cover up an affair." Megan took a step toward me, her hands trembling as if reaching for some kind of reconciliation. But I wasn't having it. I stepped back, my expression hardening. "You know what? I actually believed you when you said you wanted to fix things. I thought we were coming here to save our marriage," I continued, the bitterness in my voice unmistakable. "But I was just a fool. This vacation was never about us. It was always about you and him." She tried to speak, but her voice faltered. "Save it," I interrupted, cutting her off. "I don't need your excuses. What I need is for you to understand that the life we had, whatever it was, is over. You shattered it the moment you chose him over us." Megan collapsed onto the lounge chair, burying her face in her hands. Her body shook with sobs, but there was no comfort I could offer her. This was the consequence of her choices. The explosion of emotions that had been building up between us had finally erupted, and there was no turning back. I turned away, leaving her there on the balcony. I felt a hollow sense of relief wash over me. There was no satisfaction in seeing her break down, but there was a certain justice in it. For the first time in a long while, I was no longer the one in the dark. Megan was left to deal with the fallout, and I wasn't going to be there to pick up the pieces. The vacation was almost over, and so was our marriage. There was still one more step to take before leaving this place behind for good, and I intended to make sure Megan knew that our life together was truly coming to an end. With the vacation nearing its end, I knew it was time to prepare for the final chapter. I wasn't going to simply return home and pretend that we could somehow patch up the ruins of our marriage. I wanted Megan to feel the same devastation I had felt, to realize that her betrayal had consequences far beyond a few tears on a balcony. It was time to dismantle the life we had built together, piece by piece. The day after our explosive confrontation, Megan avoided me as much as possible, her face pale and her demeanor hollow. I could see she was trying to figure out what to do next, but it didn't matter anymore. I had already made up my mind. As she wandered around the resort, lost in her thoughts, I began laying the groundwork for my exit strategy. Back at home, there were plenty of shared assets items and accounts that were more than just things we had accumulated. They were reminders of a life I no longer wanted. I began by contacting the bank and initiating withdrawals from our joint accounts, making sure I took my share of the savings. I wasn't going to leave her with the resources to maintain the lifestyle she had grown so comfortable with. She would come home to find not just an empty house, but an empty bank account too. I also arranged for some of our more valuable possessions to be put up for sale. Artwork, jewelry, and electronics, anything that could be quickly liquidated was fair game. I contacted an appraiser and arranged for items to be picked up the day after we returned. Megan might not have known what was coming, but by the time she figured it out, it would be too late to stop it. As the days passed, I began to see the resort differently. What had once felt like paradise now seemed like a backdrop for a twisted game of deceit. I took some time alone to visit places around the island that had nothing to do with Megan, places I could remember as my own, without the shadow of betrayal hanging over me. There was a certain clarity that came with knowing I was cutting ties. I felt a strange kind of peace in planning my departure, as if I were taking control of my life for the first time in years. The night before we were set to leave, I returned to our room while Megan was out. I started packing my things, but left hers untouched. She would have to come back and face the reality of what had happened here without my help. Before I closed the suitcase, I placed a letter on top of my clothes. It was a simple note, but it said everything I needed to say. Megan, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. I know you'll come back to the house and find it different, emptier. That's because, like our marriage, it's no longer a place I can call home. You took that from me when you decided to choose him. I hope it was worth it. Goodbye. As I left the note in plain sight, I took one last look around the room. This wasn't how I had imagined our life would end, but then again, I hadn't imagined Megan's betrayal either. I didn't feel sadness or regret, only a sense of finality. I closed the suitcase and slipped out of the room, leaving the door slightly ajar behind me. It was almost symbolic, like a parting gesture that signaled an end and a beginning at the same time. Megan would find the note soon enough, and she would know that our life together was truly over. She might try to call, beg for forgiveness, or make excuses, but it didn't matter anymore. The foundation of our marriage had been destroyed, and there was nothing left to salvage. The next morning, I left the resort early. I didn't bother saying goodbye to Megan or leaving a forwarding address. I had no interest in closure. For me, this was about moving on and letting her face the consequences of her actions alone. As the plane took off, I looked down at the shrinking island below and felt a weight lift off my shoulders. There was still work to do once I got back. More things to sell, accounts to close, and memories to erase. But for the first time since discovering Megan's affair, I didn't feel anger or bitterness. I felt free. The foundation of the life we had shared was in ruins, but I was already laying the groundwork for something new, a future that didn't include her. And I was determined to make the most of it. Returning home from the island didn't feel like a homecoming, it felt like entering a battlefield. Our house, once filled with laughter and warmth, now seemed cold and empty, stripped of the life it once held. But that was the point. I had made sure of it. As soon as I arrived, I set the plan in motion, selling off anything of value that reminded me of the life Megan and I had shared. The paintings we had collected over the years, the designer furniture, even the expensive wine collection, all gone. The house was slowly turning into a shell, just like our marriage. I spent the next few days packing up my things and handling the final details. I took the time to close out joint accounts and cancel shared subscriptions. There would be no trace of me left behind, nothing Megan could cling to. I made sure she would come back to a house that was not just empty of me, but also of the life we had built together. It would be a stark reminder of the consequences of her choices, of the life she had thrown away. When Megan finally returned, it was late in the evening. I was sitting in the living room, which was now void of almost all the furniture, just a single chair in the middle of the room. She walked in and froze, her eyes wide as she took in the stripped-down surroundings. Her face was a mix of shock, confusion, and a deep sadness. I could see she was trying to process what had happened, but there was no way for her to fully grasp it yet. "Alex, what happened here?" she stammered, her voice trembling. "Why is everything gone?" I didn't rise from the chair. Instead, I looked at her with a calm that belied the storm of emotions beneath the surface. "It's over, Megan," I said simply. "You made your choice back on that island. This is the result." She took a step closer, desperation creeping into her voice. "Alex, please. I know I hurt you, but we can fix this. We can try to start over." I cut her off, my tone firm. "There's nothing left to fix. The life we had, the home we shared, it's gone. You ended it the moment you decided to lie to me, to betray me. What you see here is just the reality you created." Her eyes filled with tears as she sank onto the floor, as if her legs could no longer support her. "I didn't mean for it to end like this," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I didn't want to lose you." "You didn't lose me, Megan. You threw me away," I replied coldly. "And now you'll understand what that feels like." She began to cry openly, the kind of sobbing that comes from deep within, when a person finally realizes the full weight of their actions. But I felt no pity. I had already spent enough sleepless nights grieving the end of our marriage. Now, it was her turn to feel that loss. I stood up, preparing to leave. "I've taken what's mine," I said, my voice steady and emotionless. "You can keep the house, what's left of it. But I'm done here." She looked up at me, her eyes pleading. "Please, Alex, don't go like this. We can still talk. We can try counseling or—" I shook my head. "There's no point. I don't trust you anymore, and without trust, there's nothing. I've already spoken to a lawyer. The divorce papers will be arriving in the next few days. Just sign them and let's end this." As I turned to walk out the door, Megan rushed forward, grabbing my arm. "Please, don't leave," she begged. "I know I made mistakes, but I still love you. We can find a way to make this work." I gently pulled my arm free and looked her in the eye one last time. "Love isn't enough, Megan. Not anymore." With that, I walked out, leaving her alone in the hollow shell of our home. I didn't look back. I had already made my decision, and there was nothing more to say. I drove away, heading to a small rental apartment I had arranged for in advance, a temporary place where I could start over and figure out what came next. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine free from the memories that clung to every corner of the house I had left behind. In the weeks that followed, I focused on rebuilding my life. I took up new hobbies, threw myself into work, and reconnected with friends I had lost touch with over the years. It wasn't easy, but I found solace in the process of moving on. I had learned to live without Megan, and I was determined to create a life that didn't revolve around the pain of her betrayal. The divorce was finalized swiftly. Megan didn't contest it. Perhaps she realized there was no point in fighting for something that was already lost. We didn't speak much during the process, just the occasional formal communication through our lawyers. There was no reconciliation, no tearful apologies that could undo the damage. It was a clean break, as clean as these things could ever be. Months passed, and I found myself looking at an old vacation photo on my phone. It was from the early days of our relationship, back when we were both smiling, carefree, and unaware of what lay ahead. I deleted it without a second thought. Those memories belonged to a different time, a different version of myself. I had no need for them anymore. The last piece of closure came when I received a letter from Megan. She had written to apologize once more, to express her regret, and ask if we could remain in each other's lives in some way. I didn't respond. The final goodbye had already been said the day I walked out of that house, leaving her to face the consequences of her choices alone. Now, I was free to move forward, to build a life on a new foundation, one that I could trust wouldn't crumble beneath me. It was the start of a new chapter, one that had nothing to do with Megan and everything to do with reclaiming who I was meant to be. And that was all the closure I needed.